The text message from my brother, Marcus, changed everything. Dad's house sold yesterday. Your half comes to $127,000. I'll transfer it Monday. But as I stared at my phone in the parking lot of Seattle Children's Hospital where I work as a pediatric financial counselor, something felt wrong. Dad had been gone for only 3 months, and the house was supposed to go through probate. More importantly, we'd agreed to keep the family home until we could both emotionally handle selling it. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. But what destroyed me wasn't just Marcus's betrayal of our agreement. What I discovered over the next 6 weeks would reveal a decade-long conspiracy that involved forged documents, stolen family heirlooms worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, and a network of accomplices who had systematically stripped away everything our father had worked his entire life to build. My name is Sarah Chen, and 6 months ago I thought I had a close relationship with my older brother Marcus. At 32, I am a certified financial counselor who specializes in helping families navigate medical debt and estate planning, skills that would prove more crucial than I ever imagined. Marcus, 35, had always been the golden child in our family, a successful real estate developer who seemed to have the Midas touch with property investment. Our parents, David and Linda Chen, had immigrated from Taiwan in the 1970s and built a modest but comfortable life in Bellevue, Washington, where they raised us with strong values about family loyalty and financial responsibility. When Mom passed away from cancer 4 years ago, Dad had been devastated, but tried to stay strong for Marcus and me. The family home, a beautiful 4-bedroom craftsman built in 1952, held decades of memories and had appreciated significantly in Seattle's booming real estate market. Dad had always told us that the house would be split equally between Marcus and me when he passed, serving as our inheritance and a safety net for our futures. He'd even updated his will 2 years before his death to make sure everything was crystal clear, or so I thought. Dad's sudden heart attack in February came without warning. One moment he was healthy and active at 71, tending to his garden and planning a trip to visit relatives in Taiwan. The next morning, Marcus found him collapsed in the kitchen, and despite the paramedics' best efforts, Dad was gone. The grief was overwhelming, but Marcus stepped up immediately, handling funeral arrangements and promising to take care of all the legal and financial details, while I focused on my own healing and supporting my husband James through his recovery from a work injury that had left us financially strained. During Dad's funeral, Marcus had been the picture of a caring older brother. He gave a beautiful eulogy about Dad's legacy and how the family home represented everything our parents had achieved in America. He'd specifically mentioned that the house would remain in the family, that we'd preserve Dad's memory by keeping the place where we'd grown up and where all our holiday gatherings had taken place. Extended family members and family friends approached me afterward, commenting on how wonderful it was that Marcus and I would maintain the family property together. In the immediate aftermath of Dad's death, I was grateful for Marcus's leadership. My husband James was still on disability leave from his construction job after a back injury, and we were struggling to keep up with our mortgage payments and medical bills. The financial stress was enormous, but knowing that Dad's inheritance would eventually provide stability helped me focus on grieving rather than worrying about money. Marcus assured me repeatedly that he had everything under control, that probate would take several months, and that we'd make all major decisions together when the time came. For the first month after Dad's funeral, Marcus sent regular updates about the probate process. He explained that Dad's will was being reviewed by the court, that there were some administrative delays, and that the house appraisal was scheduled for sometime in late spring. Everything seemed to be proceeding normally, though I noticed that Marcus was vague about specific timelines and legal detail. When I offered to help with paperwork or attend court, he always declined, saying that having one point of contact would streamline the process, and that his real estate experience made him better equipped to handle property-related issues. Looking back now, I realized that Marcus's behavior during this period was carefully calculated to keep me uninformed while maintaining the appearance of transparent communication. He would call me every Sunday evening with updates that sounded detailed but contained no specific information that I could independently verify. When I asked direct questions about the probate attorney or court dates, He always had plausible explanations for why those details weren't yet finalized or why my involvement would complicate matters unnecessarily. The first real warning sign came in early April, when I drove by Dad's house to pick up some photo albums Marcus had said I could collect. The lockbox that Marcus had installed for estate-related visits was gone, and there was a for sale sign in the front yard with a realtor's name I didn't recognize. When I called Marcus immediately, he seemed flustered and explained that the probate court had required a preliminary market evaluation, which involved listing the property temporarily to establish fair market value. He assured me that the listing was just procedural, and that the house wouldn't actually be sold without our mutual agreement. But something in Marcus's voice sounded different, more defensive than his usual confident tone. When I suggested we meet to discuss the listing strategy and our long-term plans for the property, he claimed to be traveling for work and promised we'd talk in detail the following week. That conversation never happened, and my calls over the next 10 days went straight to voicemail. Marcus's sudden unavailability felt completely unlike the regular communication pattern we'd maintained since Dad's death. The next warning sign came when I received a letter from the King County Superior Court, addressed to both Marcus and me regarding Dad's estate. The letter mentioned a hearing date that had already passed, and referenced documents that I'd never seen. When I called the probate court directly, the clerk informed me that all estate communications had been sent to a single address, Marcus's business office, and that I would need to contact the attorney of record if I wanted copies of filed documents. The attorney's name was someone I'd never heard Marcus mention, and when I called that office, I was told that Marcus had instructed them to handle all beneficiary communications through him exclusively. This was when my professional background in financial counseling became invaluable. I understood enough about probate law to know that beneficiaries have legal rights to information and participation in estate proceedings. The fact that Marcus had apparently structured everything to exclude me from direct communication with the court and attorney was highly irregular and potentially illegal. I began to suspect that Marcus was either hiding something significant or planning something that he knew I wouldn't approve of. I decided to conduct my own research into Dad's estate proceedings using public records available through the King County website. What I discovered made my stomach drop. According to court filings, the probate process had been expedited through something called a simplified estate procedure that allowed for faster resolution when all beneficiaries agreed to the proposed distribution. The documents showed that I had allegedly signed waivers agreeing to immediate sale of the property and distribution of proceeds. My signature was on legal documents that I had never seen, let alone signed. The forged signature was skillful but not perfect. Having worked in financial services for nearly a decade, I'd seen enough fraudulent documents to recognize the telltale signs of forgery. The pen pressure was inconsistent, the letter formation slightly different from my natural handwriting, and most damn, the signature was dated on a day when I'd been in Portland attending a professional conference, something I could easily prove with hotel receipts and seminar attendance records. I immediately contacted a probate attorney recommended by a colleague at the hospital. Rebecca Martinez was a seasoned estate attorney who specialized in beneficiary disputes and had seen similar cases of sibling fraud in the past. When I showed her the forged documents and explained the timeline of Marcus's behavior, her expression grew increasingly serious. She explained that what Marcus had done constituted multiple felonies, including forgery, fraud, and potentially theft of assets worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. The legal picture Rebecca painted was devastating. Marcus had apparently been planning this deception for months. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Possibly even before Dad's death, the expedited probate process required specific legal filings and coordination with court officials that suggested advanced preparation and knowledge of probate procedures that went far beyond what a typical person would understand. Marcus hadn't just impulsively decided to sell the house. He'd orchestrated an elaborate legal fraud designed to steal my inheritance while maintaining plausible deniability about his actions. But Rebecca's analysis revealed an even more disturbing possibility. The forged signatures and expedited probate timeline suggested that Marcus might have had access to Dad's estate planning documents and legal affairs for some time before Dad's death. There were indications that some of the preliminary paperwork had been filed unusually quickly after Dad's death, suggesting that Marcus had been preparing for this outcome rather than reacting to unexpected circumstances. When I asked Rebecca about the likelihood of recovering my inheritance and holding Marcus accountable for his crimes, she was cautiously optimistic but warned me about the challenges ahead. Proving forgery and fraud in estate cases requires extensive documentation and often involves lengthy court battles that can be emotionally and financially draining for family. Moreover, if Marcus had already spent or transferred the money from the house sale, recovery might be complicated even if we proved the fraud conclusively. The conversation with Rebecca transformed my grief and confusion into cold determination. Marcus hadn't just stolen money from me, he'd violated Dad's final wishes and destroyed the trust that had held our family together for decades. But more than that, his elaborate deception suggested a level of premeditation and callousness that made me question everything I thought I knew about my brother's character and our relationship. I spent the following week gathering every document I could find related to Dad's estate, our family's financial history, and Marcus's recent business activity. Using my professional network and research skills, I began building a comprehensive timeline of Marcus's actions and identifying potential evidence of his fraud. What I discovered during this initial investigation would prove to be just the tip of the iceberg. The first major breakthrough came when I found Dad's personal filing cabinet in his basement office, which Marcus had apparently overlooked during his systematic removal of important documents from the house. Hidden behind tax returns from the 1990s, I found a manila envelope marked estate planning, original copies, and Dad's careful handwriting. Inside were documents that contradicted everything Marcus had told me about Dad's will and estate plan. The original will, dated just 18 months before Dad's death, was dramatically different from the version that had been filed with the probate court. In Dad's actual will, the family home was to be held in trust for both Marcus and me, with specific provisions preventing either of us from selling without the other's written consent. The will also included detailed instructions for preserving family heirlooms and personal property, including Mom's jewelry collection and Dad's extensive library of first edition books that I hadn't seen since the funeral. More importantly, the original will included specific language protecting against exactly the kind of fraud Marcus had committed. Dad had apparently been concerned about potential disputes between Marcus and me, and had included provisions requiring both beneficiaries to sign off on any major estate decisions in the presence of the estate attorney. The will also specified that any attempt to circumvent these protections would result in the offending party forfeiting their inheritance entirely. The implications were staggering. Not only had Marcus forged documents and defrauded me out of my inheritance, but according to Dad's actual will, his actions should have resulted in him losing his own inheritance as well. The house sale that Marcus had orchestrated was completely invalid, and he was legally entitled to nothing from Dad's estate due to his fraudulent conduct. But the most heartbreaking discovery was a letter Dad had written to both Marcus and me, sealed in an envelope marked to be opened together after my death. The letter spoke about his hopes for our future, his trust in our ability to support each other through difficult times, and his confidence that the inheritance he was leaving would strengthen our family bond rather than divide us. Reading Dad's words about family loyalty and mutual support while knowing what Marcus had done felt like losing Dad all over again. Armed with Dad's original estate documents and evidence of Marcus's fraud, I called him the next morning and left a message requesting an immediate meeting to discuss irregularities I'd discovered in the probate proceeding. His return call came within an hour, and his tone was noticeably different from our previous conversations. Gone was the confident, protective older brother who had been handling everything for my benefit. Instead, Marcus sounded nervous and defensive, asking specifically what I'd found and suggesting that there might have been administrative errors in the court filing. When I mentioned that I'd found Dad's original will and estate documents, the silence on the phone stretched for nearly 30 seconds. Marcus finally responded with a confused explanation about multiple versions of Dad's will and possible outdated documents that might not reflect Dad's final wishes. He suggested that we meet the following week to clear up any confusion and ensure that everything was handled properly going forward. But I could hear the panic in Marcus's voice, and his sudden willingness to include me in estate decisions that he'd previously claimed were his sole responsibility confirmed that he knew his fraud had been exposed. The question now was how far Marcus's deception extended and whether there were other victims or accomplices involved in systematically looting Dad's estate. The meeting with Marcus never happened. 2 days after our phone conversation, I received another text message that would change everything. Sarah, I need to tell you something important about Dad's finances. Can we meet tomorrow? There are some complications with the estate that I need to explain. But by then I'd already uncovered evidence that Marcus's fraud was part of a much larger conspiracy that had been operating for years before Dad's death. My investigation into Dad's financial records revealed a pattern of suspicious transactions dating back nearly 3 years. Large withdrawals from Dad's savings accounts, changes to investment beneficiaries, and transfers of valuable assets that Dad would never have authorized without discussing with me first. Marcus hadn't just stolen my inheritance after Dad's death, he'd been systematically stealing from Dad while he was alive, exploiting his position as Dad's trusted son to embezzle hundreds of thousands of dollars over several years. The scope of Marcus's betrayal was breathtaking in its audacity and heartbreaking in its violation of everything our family had valued. But what I would discover over the next several weeks about his accomplices and the network of professionals who had enabled his crimes would prove that this wasn't just sibling rivalry gone wrong. This was organized fraud that had destroyed not just my family, but potentially dozens of other families who had trusted Marcus with their most valuable assets. The war for justice was about to begin, and I had every intention of winning. The call from First National Bank came at 7:23 a.m. on a Tuesday morning while I was getting ready for work. The voice on the other end belonged to Janet Morrison, a senior banking representative who explained that there had been unusual activity on an account associated with my father's estate. When she mentioned that someone had attempted to access a safe deposit box, registered under both my father's and my name, my blood ran cold. I had no knowledge of any safe deposit box. Dad had never mentioned having one, and it certainly hadn't been listed in any of the estate documents Marcus had shown me. Janet explained that the attempted access had triggered a security protocol because the person trying to open the box had provided identification that didn't match the authorized signatures on file. She asked if I could come in that morning to verify my identity and discuss the account. The drive to the bank felt surreal. Every revelation about Marcus's deception had been shocking, but this felt different. A secret safe deposit box suggested that Dad had been hiding something, or more likely that Marcus had discovered something he was trying to steal without my knowledge. The implications were staggering because safe deposit boxes typically contained either highly valuable items or sensitive documents that people wanted to protect from theft or damage. Janet Morrison was a professional woman in her 50s, who had clearly dealt with family disputes over estates before. When I showed her my identification and signed the access forms, she explained that the safe deposit box had been established 7 years earlier with both my father and me listed as authorized users. The box rental fees had been automatically deducted from one of Dad's accounts, which explained why I'd never seen any bills or notices about its existence. The person who had attempted to access the box the previous afternoon had provided identification for Marcus Chen, but when the bank staff checked the signature card, his name wasn't listed as an authorized user. Janet showed me the attempted access log, which indicated that Marcus had become aggressive when denied access and claimed that his sister Sarah was trying to steal family assets. He'd apparently demanded to speak with a manager and threatened legal action against the bank for preventing him from accessing his father's property. The safe deposit box itself was larger than I'd expected, about the size of a filing cabinet drawer. When Janet used her master key along with Dad's key, which had been found among his personal effects, the contents took my breath away. Stacks of documents, jewelry boxes, and manila envelopes filled the space completely. Dad had clearly been using this box to protect the most important and valuable items he owned. The first item I examined was a thick folder labeled Marcus Financial Records in Dad's handwriting. Inside were bank statements, canceled checks, and correspondence that documented years of financial transactions between Dad and Marcus that I'd never known about. The earliest documents dated back nearly 5 years and showed a pattern of large loans from Dad to Marcus for various real estate investments and business ventures. What made these documents devastating was not just the amounts involved, which totaled over $400,000, but the fact that virtually none of these loans had ever been repaid. The records showed repeated extensions, renegotiated terms, and eventually forgiven debt that had apparently been accumulating for years. Dad had been quietly financing Marcus's business empire without ever mentioning it to me, and Marcus had been systematically defaulting on his obligations while maintaining the appearance of financial success. But more disturbing were the recent documents showing that Marcus had been pressuring Dad to convert these loans into gifts or early inheritance distribution. There were letters from Marcus arguing that he deserved a larger share of Dad's estate because of his business acumen and his willingness to take care of Dad in his old age. Some of the correspondence had a manipulative tone that made me sick, with Marcus suggesting that Dad's refusal to forgive the loans was creating family tension and preventing Marcus from providing better care for Dad's needs. The jewelry boxes contained Mom's entire collection, including pieces I'd assumed were lost or had been distributed to relatives after her death. Her diamond engagement ring, the pearl necklace Dad had given her for their 20th anniversary, and dozens of other pieces that held enormous sentimental value beyond their considerable monetary worth. There was also a handwritten note from Dad explaining that he'd moved Mom's jewelry to the safe deposit box because he was concerned about security at the house, especially given that Marcus had keys and frequently visited when Dad wasn't home. That note about security concerns related to Marcus hit me like a physical blow. Dad had been worried about Marcus's access to the house and had taken steps to protect Mom's jewelry from potential theft. The timeline of when Dad had moved these items to the bank coincided with Marcus's increasing financial pressures and his request for larger loans. Dad had apparently realized that Marcus posed a risk to family assets, but hadn't felt comfortable confronting him directly about his suspicion. Among the documents was a folder containing what appeared to be Dad's real estate research and property valuations. Dad had been meticulously tracking the value of our family home and had obtained multiple professional appraisals over the past 2 years. The most recent appraisal, dated just 3 months before Dad's death, valued the property at over $800,000, significantly higher than the $400,000 sale price Marcus had claimed to receive. This discrepancy raised immediate questions about whether Marcus had actually sold the house for its fair market value, or had arranged some kind of below-market transaction that benefited him personally. If Marcus had sold the house to an associate or business partner for less than its appraised value, he could have defrauded not just me but also any creditors or tax authorities who had a legitimate interest in Dad's estate receiving fair value for its assets. But the most shocking discovery was a thick envelope labeled Legal Evidence, Marcus Fraud Investigation, that contained documents Dad had apparently been collecting about Marcus's business practices. The folder included correspondence with other families who had invested in Marcus's real estate projects, complaints filed with the Better Business Bureau, and even preliminary discussions with an attorney about potential legal action against Marcus for investment fraud. Dad had discovered that Marcus was running what appeared to be a Ponzi scheme through his real estate development company. Marcus would solicit investments from friends, family members, and professional contacts for supposedly lucrative property development projects. He would use money from new investors to pay returns to earlier investors while skimming substantial amounts for personal use. The scheme had been operating for at least 3 years and involved dozens of victims who had collectively invested over $2 million in projects that either didn't exist or were worth far less than Marcus claimed. Reading through Dad's investigation files, I realized that he'd been trying to protect not just our family's assets, but also the other families who had trusted Marcus with their savings. Dad had documented meetings with victims, collected financial records showing the flow of money through Marcus's various business entities, and even hired a private investigator to surveillance Marcus's activities and verify the existence of the development projects he was promoting to investors. The private investigator's reports were damning. Marcus had been using investor money to fund his personal lifestyle, including expensive cars, luxury vacations, and a downtown Seattle condominium that he'd purchased under a corporate name to hide it from creditors and potentially from Dad's scrutiny. The investigator had photographed Marcus at high-end restaurants and exclusive clubs, living a lifestyle that was completely inconsistent with his claimed business struggles and need for family loan. More disturbing was evidence that Marcus had been targeting elderly investors specifically, using his reputation as Dad's successful son to gain credibility with seniors who were looking for safe investment opportunities for their retirement savings. Several victims were family friends who had known Marcus since childhood and trusted him completely based on their relationship with our parents. Marcus had exploited their trust and stolen money they couldn't afford to lose. Among Dad's files was a letter he'd never sent, addressed to me and dated just 2 weeks before his death. In the letter, Dad explained that he'd been investigating Marcus's financial activities because several family friends had approached him with concerns about investments that weren't producing promised returns. Dad wrote that he was planning to confront Marcus and demand that he make restitution to all victims, but that he wanted to gather complete evidence first to ensure that Marcus couldn't deny or minimize his crime. The letter also revealed that Dad suspected Marcus had been accessing his personal financial accounts without permission. Dad had noticed unexplained withdrawals and transfers that Marcus claimed were related to estate planning or investment opportunities that Dad had supposedly authorized. Dad wrote that he was planning to change all his account passwords and require dual signatures for any future transactions involving Marcus. Reading Dad's letter, I realized that his sudden death might not have been as coincidental as it initially appeared. The timing of Dad's heart attack, just as he was preparing to expose Marcus's crimes and protect other victims, seemed suspicious. While I had no evidence that Marcus had directly caused Dad's death, the possibility that stress from discovering his son's criminal behavior had contributed to Dad's fatal heart attack made Marcus's betrayal even more devastating. I spent 3 hours at the bank photographing every document and piece of evidence Dad had collected. Janet Morrison was patient and professional, understanding that what I was discovering had serious legal implications that went far beyond typical family disputes over inheritance. She also provided me with copies of all the safe deposit box access logs, which showed that Dad had been visiting the box regularly in the months before his death, apparently continuing to add evidence as he uncovered more details about Marcus's fraud. When I finally left the bank, I felt overwhelmed by the scope of what Dad had discovered and the responsibility of deciding what to do with his evidence. Dad had clearly intended to take action against Marcus, but his death had prevented him from following through on his plan. Now I had to decide whether to continue Dad's investigation and pursue justice for all of Marcus's victims, or focus solely on recovering my own inheritance and protecting myself from further fraud. The drive home gave me time to process the implications of everything I'd learned. Marcus wasn't just a brother who had stolen my inheritance in a moment of greed or poor judgment. He was a career criminal who had been systematically defrauding family members, friends, and vulnerable seniors for years. His theft of my inheritance was just the latest in a long series of crimes that had destroyed the financial security of dozens of families. But I also realized that Dad's investigation provided me with powerful leverage against Marcus. If I could prove that Marcus was running investment fraud schemes while simultaneously stealing from Dad's estate, I might be able to not only recover my inheritance, but also help other victims get justice and potentially prevent Marcus from victimizing additional families in the future. That evening, I called Rebecca Martinez, the probate attorney I'd consulted about the forged estate documents. When I explained what I'd discovered in Dad's safe deposit box, she was silent for several minutes before responding. She explained that the evidence Dad had collected suggested a pattern of criminal behavior that went far beyond probate fraud and could result in federal charges related to wire fraud, money laundering, and potentially elder abuse. Rebecca recommended that I contact the FBI's white-collar crime division immediately, as Marcus's investment fraud appeared to involve interstate transactions and sophisticated financial manipulation that fell under federal jurisdiction. She also suggested that I contact the victims Dad had identified to warn them about Marcus's crimes and encourage them to cooperate with law enforcement investigations. But Rebecca also warned me about the personal risks of taking on such a complex case. Marcus had demonstrated his willingness to forge documents and lie to courts, and confronting him with evidence of his broader criminal activities could provoke him to take more desperate measures to protect himself. She recommended that I consider hiring personal security and avoid being alone with Marcus until law enforcement could take him into custody. The conversation with Rebecca crystallized my decision about how to proceed. I wasn't just going to pursue recovering my inheritance. I was going to use every piece of evidence Dad had collected to ensure that Marcus faced justice for all his crimes, and that his victims received whatever restitution might be possible. Dad had started this investigation to protect people he cared about, and I was going to finish what he'd started. Over the next several days, I began contacting the victims whose information Dad had collected. The conversations were heartbreaking, as many of these families had invested their entire retirement savings with Marcus based on their trust in our family's reputation. Several victims were elderly couples who had known my parents for decades and considered Marcus almost like a grandson. Margaret and Robert Peterson were among the most devastating cases. They had invested $60,000 with Marcus 2 years earlier for what he claimed was a luxury condominium development project in downtown Bellevue. Marcus had shown them detailed architectural plans, building permits, and financial projections that convinced them the investment would provide steady income throughout their retirement. They had received modest monthly payments for the first year, which Marcus claimed were rental income from completed units. But when the payments stopped 6 months ago, Marcus had provided increasingly elaborate explanations about construction delays, permit issues, and temporary cash flow problems that would be resolved once the project reached full occupancy. The Petersons had trusted these explanations because Marcus had always been so professional and because they knew our family's reputation for honesty and integrity. When I showed Margaret the evidence Dad had collected proving that the condominium project didn't exist, she started crying. She explained that the $60,000 represented money Robert had saved from 40 years of working as a machinist, and that losing it would force them to sell their home and move in with relatives. The financial devastation Marcus had caused went far beyond mere theft. He had destroyed the retirement security these families had worked their entire lives to achieve. Similar stories emerged from every victim I contacted. Marcus had tailored his fraud to each family's specific financial situation and dreams, offering investment opportunities that seemed perfectly suited to their needs and risk tolerance. He had exploited relationships that went back decades, using childhood memories and family connections to bypass the skepticism these investors might have shown to strangers offering similar deals. The total amount Marcus had stolen from family, friends, and community members exceeded $2.3 million, affecting 27 families who had trusted him with their savings. Some victims had invested relatively small amounts that they could absorb without devastating consequences, but others had put their entire life savings into Marcus's fraudulent schemes and faced financial ruin as a result of his crime. As I compiled a comprehensive list of victims and documented the scope of Marcus's fraud, I realized that pursuing justice would require a coordinated effort involving multiple law enforcement agencies, regulatory bodies, and legal professionals. The complexity of Marcus's schemes and the number of victims involved meant that this would likely become a high-profile case that could take years to resolve fully. But I also understood that exposing Marcus's crimes was about more than recovering money or achieving legal justice. Dad had spent the final months of his life trying to protect people he cared about from Marcus's deception. Completing Dad's investigation and ensuring that Marcus faced consequences for his actions was a way of honoring Dad's memory and value. The evidence Dad had collected would prove to be just the beginning of what I would uncover about Marcus's criminal activity. Over the following weeks, my investigation would reveal connections to other fraudulent real estate developers, corrupt officials who had facilitated Marcus's schemes, and a network of accomplices who had helped him maintain his deception for years. Marcus had built an empire of lies that extended far beyond our family and had caused devastating harm to dozens of innocent people who had trusted him with their financial future. But Dad's meticulous documentation had provided me with the tools to tear down that empire and ensure that justice was finally served. The war against Marcus was escalating, and I was determined to win not just for myself and my inheritance, but for every family he had betrayed and every victim whose trust he had violated. The safe deposit box had revealed the true scope of his crimes, and now it was time to use that evidence to hold him accountable for everything he had done. The call from FBI Special Agent Victoria Reeves came 3 days after I'd submitted my formal complaint about Marcus's investment fraud scheme. Her voice was professional but carried an undertone of urgency that immediately captured my attention. She explained that my case had been flagged because it connected to an ongoing federal investigation into a network of real estate fraud that had been operating across Washington and Oregon for the past 4 years. Agent Reeves requested a meeting at the FBI field office in downtown Seattle, explaining that the evidence I'd provided about Marcus's activities had filled in crucial gaps in their investigation. When I arrived at the federal building the following morning, I was surprised to find myself in a conference room with not just Agent Reeves, but also representatives from the Securities and Exchange Commission, the Internal Revenue Service, and the Washington State Attorney General's office. The scope of the investigation was far more extensive than I had imagined. Agent Reeves explained that Marcus was part of a sophisticated criminal network that included corrupt real estate agents, fraudulent appraisers, and even officials in local building departments who had been facilitating fake development projects for substantial bribes. The network had been stealing money from investors while also manipulating property values and avoiding taxes through shell companies and offshore accounts. What made my evidence particularly valuable was that Dad's investigation had documented the internal workings of Marcus's operation in ways that law enforcement had been unable to penetrate. Dad's relationship with Marcus had given him access to conversations, documents, and meetings that outside investigators couldn't observe. The private investigator Dad had hired had captured photographs and recordings that provided crucial proof of criminal activity that would have been nearly impossible to obtain through traditional surveillance methods. Agent Reeves showed me a wall-sized chart mapping the connections between various members of the fraud network. Marcus appeared in the center, connected by lines to dozens of other individuals and business entities. Seeing the visual representation of his criminal enterprise was overwhelming because it revealed that Marcus had been operating at a level of sophistication and scale that went far beyond what I'd understood from Dad's individual case file. The network had stolen an estimated $12 million from over 200 victims across the Pacific Northwest. Marcus was one of the primary operators, but he was working with at least 6 other real estate developers who were running similar schemes in different geographic areas. They shared resources, referred victims to each other, and coordinated their activities to avoid detection by law enforcement and regulatory agencies. Special Agent Jennifer Walsh from the IRS explained that Marcus and his associates had been using an intricate system of shell companies and fake business entities to launder the money they stole from investors. They would create legitimate-looking real estate development companies, use those companies to solicit investments, then transfer the money through multiple accounts and offshore entities to make it virtually impossible to trace. Some of the stolen funds had been moved to accounts in the Cayman Islands and Switzerland, which would complicate efforts to recover money for victims. But the most shocking revelation came when Agent Reeves explained that Marcus's network had been targeting not just individual investors, but also pension funds, charitable organizations, and even some smaller banks that were looking for real estate investment opportunities. The scale of their operations had grown so large that they were now considered a threat to the stability of regional financial institutions that had unknowingly become involved in their scheme. The investigation had been triggered 18 months earlier when a suspicious activity report was filed by a major Seattle bank regarding unusual wire transfers associated with one of Marcus's shell companies. The initial investigation had focused on money laundering, but as agents dug deeper, they discovered the extensive investment fraud that was generating the dirty money Marcus and his associates needed to launder. What made the case particularly complex was that Marcus and his associates had been very careful to maintain the appearance of legitimate business operations. They had real offices, professional marketing materials, and even some actual real estate projects that were designed to provide credibility for their fraudulent schemes. The mixture of legitimate and criminal activities made it difficult for victims to recognize the fraud and for law enforcement to build clear cases against the perpetrators. Agent Reeves explained that my complaint had provided them with the missing piece they needed to understand how the network recruited victims and maintained their confidence over extended periods. Dad's documentation showed the psychological manipulation tactics Marcus used to exploit family relationships and community trust, which helped investigators understand how the network had been able to operate for so long without being exposed. The federal investigation had been proceeding slowly because of the network's sophisticated operational security and the difficulty of getting victims to cooperate with law enforcement. Many victims were elderly or financially unsophisticated, and they were often embarrassed about being defrauded or worried that cooperating with investigators would somehow make their financial losses worse. Some victims had been threatened by network members and were afraid to come forward with information. But Dad's evidence provided law enforcement with detailed documentation that didn't depend on victim testimony or cooperation. The financial records, private investigator reports, and recorded conversations Dad had collected were objective evidence that could be used to build criminal cases even if individual victims were reluctant to participate in prosecution. Agent Reeves asked if I would be willing to serve as a cooperating witness in the federal investigation. This would involve wearing recording devices during any future conversations with Marcus, providing access to additional family documents that might contain evidence of his crime, and potentially testifying before a federal grand jury that would be considering criminal indictments against the entire network. The request forced me to confront the reality that pursuing justice for Marcus's crimes would require me to take on significant personal risks and emotional challenges. Serving as a federal cooperating witness would mean that my relationship with Marcus would become permanently adversarial, and that I would be helping to build a case that could result in him spending decades in federal prison. But Agent Reeves also explained that my cooperation could be crucial for protecting other families from becoming victims of the network's ongoing fraud scheme. The investigation suggested that Marcus and his associates were actively recruiting new investors and planning to expand their operations into other states. Without intervention, they could steal millions more dollars from unsuspecting families over the next several years. The decision to cooperate with the federal investigation wasn't just about seeking justice for Dad's death and my stolen inheritance. It was about preventing Marcus and his criminal associates from destroying the financial security of dozens of additional families who were vulnerable to their sophisticated manipulation tactics. I agreed to serve as a cooperating witness, and Agent Reeves immediately began preparing me for the technical and legal aspects of gathering evidence against Marcus. She explained that federal wiretapping laws required very specific procedures for recording conversations, and that any mistakes in following those procedures could make valuable evidence inadmissible in court and potentially compromise the entire investigation. The FBI provided me with sophisticated recording equipment that was virtually undetectable when properly concealed. Agent Reeves and her technical team trained me on how to position the equipment for optimal audio quality, how to steer conversations toward topics that would elicit incriminating statements from Marcus, and how to protect my own safety if Marcus became suspicious or aggressive during recorded meetings. The psychological preparation was more challenging than the technical training. Agent Reeves connected me with Dr. Patricia Kim, a forensic psychologist who specialized in helping law enforcement witnesses cope with the emotional stress of investigating family members and close associates. Kim explained that what I was doing would likely cause significant psychological trauma because it required me to deliberately deceive someone I had trusted and loved for my entire life. Dr. Kim helped me understand that Marcus's criminal behavior had already destroyed our family relationship, and that my investigation was simply revealing the truth about damage that had already occurred rather than causing new harm. She taught me techniques for managing the emotional stress of recorded conversations and for protecting my mental health throughout what would likely be a lengthy and emotionally draining legal process. But the most important preparation involved developing a strategy for approaching Marcus in ways that would encourage him to discuss his criminal activities openly. Agent Reeves explained that Marcus's narcissism and need to justify his actions would likely make him want to explain his sophisticated schemes to someone he believed was supportive or impressed by his intelligence and business acumen. The plan we developed involved me approaching Marcus as a concerned sister who was worried about the legal complications surrounding Dad's estate and wanted his help navigating the complex financial issues I'd discovered. By positioning myself as someone who needed Marcus's expertise and guidance, we hoped to encourage him to reveal details about his fraud schemes that he might not share if he felt he was being interrogated or confronted. Agent Reeves also explained that the federal investigation had identified several of Marcus's associates who might be present during our conversations, and that recording their statements could be equally valuable for building cases against the entire criminal network. The FBI had been trying to penetrate the network's inner circle for months, and my family relationship with Marcus provided a unique opportunity to gather intelligence about their operations and future plans. The first recorded conversation was scheduled for the following week, ostensibly a family meeting to discuss the complications I'd discovered in Dad's estate plan. Marcus had been avoiding my calls since I'd mentioned finding irregularities in the probate proceedings, but when I approached the meeting as a request for his help and expertise, he agreed to meet at his downtown office. Marcus's office was located in a gleaming high-rise building that projected an image of success and professional legitimacy. The suite was expensively furnished with modern art and high-end electronics that must have cost more than many families earned in a year. Seeing the luxury that Marcus had purchased with money stolen from hard-working families made me sick, but I forced myself to maintain the supportive, slightly confused demeanor that Agent Reeves and I had rehearsed. Marcus greeted me with his typical confident smile, but I could see tension around his eyes that suggested he was more worried about my discoveries than he was willing to admit. He offered me coffee and asked about James's recovery from his work injury, maintaining the facade of caring family relationships even as he tried to assess how much I knew about his criminal activities. When I explained that I'd found confusing documents in Dad's papers that suggested there might have been financial irregularities or estate planning complications, Marcus immediately shifted into what I now recognized as his manipulation. He spoke with authority about complex legal and financial concepts, positioned himself as the family expert who could handle these problems, and subtly suggested that my concerns were probably based on misunderstanding documents that were perfectly legitimate. But when I mentioned that some of the documents suggested Dad had been concerned about unauthorized access to his accounts, Marcus's demeanor changed noticeably. He became defensive and started providing unsolicited explanations about times when Dad had asked him to help with banking or investment matters. The level of detail Marcus provided about his access to Dad's finances was far more extensive than anything he'd previously admitted, and the recording device captured every word. Marcus explained that Dad had given him power of attorney for certain financial matters because Dad was getting older and wanted help managing his increasingly complex investment portfolio. He claimed that Dad had specifically asked him to consolidate some accounts and reorganize assets to minimize tax liability and simplify estate planning. According to Marcus, everything he had done was authorized by Dad and was intended to benefit both Marcus and me as Dad's heir. But the explanations Marcus provided contradicted the timeline and documentation I'd found in Dad's safe deposit box. Marcus claimed that Dad had authorized transfers and account changes that Dad's own records showed he had discovered and was investigating as unauthorized fraud. The inconsistencies in Marcus's story provided exactly the kind of evidence Agent Reeves had hoped to capture. When I asked Marcus about the investment projects that several family friends had mentioned, he became animated and started describing his real estate development business with obvious pride. He spoke about his vision for transforming underutilized properties into luxury residential and commercial developments that would provide strong returns for investors while revitalizing Seattle's urban landscape. Marcus's description of his business operations was polished and convincing, full of impressive statistics about projected returns and market analysis that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of real estate economics. If I hadn't known that most of his projects were fraudulent, I might have been impressed by his apparent expertise and business acumen. His ability to sound credible and knowledgeable explained how he had been able to fool so many intelligent, experienced investors. But when I asked specific questions about the projects that Dad's friends had invested in, Marcus provided details that the FBI investigation had already proven to be false. He described construction progress, building permits, and tenant agreements for developments that didn't exist. The recording captured him making specific factual claims that could be easily disproven with public records, and that would be devastating evidence in any criminal trial. The conversation lasted nearly 2 hours, during which Marcus provided incriminating details about his access to Dad's finances, his manipulation of estate planning documents, and his fraudulent investment scheme. He was so focused on maintaining his image as a successful businessman and caring brother that he didn't realize he was confessing to multiple felonies that were being recorded for federal investigators. When I finally left Marcus's office, I felt emotionally drained but professionally satisfied with what we had accomplished. The recording contained clear admissions of criminal behavior that would be difficult for Marcus to explain or deny in court. Agent Reeves and her team were pleased with the quality and content of the evidence we had gathered, but the investigation was far from over. Agent Reeves explained that building a comprehensive case against Marcus and his associates would require multiple recorded conversations, additional evidence gathering, and coordination with victims and other witnesses who could testify about the impact of the network's crime. Over the following weeks, I would participate in several more recorded conversations with Marcus and his associates, gradually gathering the evidence federal prosecutors needed to build an ironclad case against the entire criminal network. Each conversation revealed new details about the scope of their operations and the sophistication of their fraud schemes. The investigation was also uncovering connections between Marcus's network and other criminal organizations involved in money laundering, tax evasion, and political corruption. What had started as a case about stolen inheritance was evolving into a major federal investigation that could expose corruption and financial crimes extending far beyond the real estate industry. Marcus had no idea that his sister was working with federal agents to destroy his criminal empire, but he was about to discover that the family loyalty he had exploited for so many years would ultimately be the weapon used to bring him to justice. The recordings I was gathering would not only help me recover my inheritance, but also ensure that Marcus and his associates faced federal prosecution for their systematic theft from hundreds of innocent victims. The war against Marcus and his criminal network was escalating into a federal case that would expose the full scope of their crimes and ensure that justice was finally served for every family they had betrayed and robbed. The text message from Marcus arrived at 11:47 p.m. on a Thursday night, 3 weeks after our recorded conversation at his office. The message was different from his usual communications, shorter and more urgent. "Sarah, we need to talk immediately. There are people asking questions about our family. Meet me tomorrow at the Fairmont Olympic Hotel lobby at 2 p.m. Come alone and don't tell anyone about this meeting." The timing and tone of Marcus's message triggered every warning signal Agent Reeves had trained me to recognize. Marcus had been increasingly paranoid over the past week, canceling 2 scheduled meetings and asking unusual questions about whether I'd spoken to anyone about Dad's estate complication. The FBI surveillance team had observed him meeting with associates at unusual locations and times, suggesting that the criminal network was aware they were under investigation. Agent Reeves immediately activated an emergency response protocol when I forwarded Marcus's message. Within an hour, I was at the FBI field office being briefed on enhanced security measures and backup plans for what could be a dangerous confrontation. The technical team equipped me with multiple recording devices and a GPS tracking system that would allow agents to monitor my location and safety throughout the meeting. The surveillance team had discovered that Marcus's associate, David Rodriguez, had been making inquiries about federal investigation procedures and had recently hired a criminal defense attorney who specialized in white-collar fraud cases. The network appeared to be preparing for possible criminal charges, which meant they might be willing to take desperate measures to eliminate witnesses or destroy evidence. Agent Reeves explained that Marcus's request to meet at a public hotel suggested he was either planning to flee Seattle or attempting to determine how much I knew about the investigation before deciding how to respond to the threat I represent. Either scenario required extreme caution because cornered criminals with sophisticated resources could be extremely dangerous when they felt their freedom was threatened. The Fairmont Olympic Hotel was chosen by Marcus because it provided multiple exit routes and enough background noise to make surveillance difficult. The FBI team positioned agents throughout the hotel's public areas, disguised as business travelers and hotel guests. They established communication protocols that would allow them to intervene immediately if Marcus became threatening or if the situation appeared to be escalating toward violence. Dr. Tricia Kim provided emergency psychological preparation for what could be the most challenging conversation of my life. She warned me that Marcus might try to manipulate me emotionally by appealing to family loyalty or claiming that his actions had been motivated by good intention. She coached me on techniques for maintaining emotional control while encouraging Marcus to reveal information about his criminal activities and future plans. When I arrived at the hotel lobby, Marcus was already seated in a corner booth that provided privacy while allowing him to observe everyone entering and leaving the area. He looked haggard and stressed, completely different from the confident businessman who had greeted me in his office 3 weeks earlier. His expensive suit couldn't hide the fact that he had lost weight and appeared to be sleeping poorly. Marcus stood to greet me, but his usual warm smile was replaced by a tense expression that suggested he was operating under enormous pressure. He ordered coffee for both of us and spent several minutes making small talk about James's recovery and my work at the hospital, but his conversation lacked the natural flow that had characterized our previous interaction. When Marcus finally addressed the reason for our meeting, his tone became serious and slightly threatening. He explained that he'd been contacted by investigators who were asking questions about his business activities and Dad's estate, and that these inquiries could potentially cause problems for our entire family if they weren't handled carefully. Marcus claimed that the investigators were part of a broader government effort to target successful real estate developers and that their questions about his business practices were based on false information provided by disgruntled former business partners. He positioned himself as the victim of a vindictive investigation and suggested that our family needed to present a united front against outside interference in our private financial affairs. But as Marcus continued talking, it became clear that he suspected I had been providing information to investigators and that this meeting was actually an attempt to determine what I knew and potentially silence me. He asked pointed questions about whether I'd spoken to anyone about Dad's estate documents, whether I'd been contacted by law enforcement, and whether I understood the serious legal consequences that could result from providing false information to federal investigators. The recording equipment captured Marcus's subtle threats and attempts at intimidation. He suggested that if I had accidentally provided misleading information to investigators, he could help me correct those mistakes before they caused irreparable damage to our family's reputation. He offered to represent me in any legal proceedings and claimed that his attorney had experience handling federal investigations involving families who had been unfairly targeted. When I maintained that I hadn't spoken to anyone about our private family matters, Marcus's demeanor shifted toward more direct confrontation. He pulled out a folder containing copies of bank records and legal documents that he claimed proved all his actions regarding Dad's estate had been legitimate and authorized. He insisted that any suggestion otherwise was based on misunderstanding complex financial arrangements that Dad had specifically requested. But the documents Marcus showed me were different from the originals I'd found in Dad's safe deposit box. The signatures appeared to be forged, the dates had been altered, and several key provisions that protected my inheritance rights had been changed or removed entirely. Marcus was essentially confessing to document forgery while claiming that his fraudulent papers proved his innocence. Marcus's explanation of his real estate investment business became increasingly desperate as he tried to justify the complaints that victims had apparently made to investigators. He claimed that all investment losses were due to market conditions beyond his control and that he had personally lost more money than any of his investors. According to Marcus, he was actually the primary victim of economic circumstances that had prevented his developments from succeeding as planned. The conversation took a darker turn when Marcus began talking about the personal sacrifices he'd made to protect our family's financial interests. He claimed that Dad had been making poor financial decisions in his final years and that Marcus had been forced to take control of family assets to prevent Dad from squandering the inheritance that Marcus and I would eventually receive. Marcus described Dad's investigation into his business activities as evidence that Dad had been suffering from early-stage dementia that affected his judgment and made him paranoid about imaginary threats to family finance. According to Marcus, Dad's concerns about unauthorized access to his accounts were symptoms of cognitive decline rather than legitimate worries about financial fraud. This attack on Dad's mental competence was particularly infuriating because I knew from Dad's detailed investigation files that his thinking had been completely clear and logical right up until his death. Marcus was essentially claiming that Dad's efforts to protect other families from investment fraud were evidence of mental illness, a level of gaslighting that revealed the depth of Marcus's narcissism and his willingness to destroy anyone who threatened his criminal activities. When I challenged Marcus's characterization of Dad's mental state, he became more aggressive and started making veiled threats about the consequences of family disloyalty. He suggested that if family members provided information to outside investigators that contradicted his version of events, those family members could face serious legal liability for making false statements or interfering with legitimate business operations. Marcus also implied that he had powerful connections who could make life difficult for anyone who caused problems for his business activities. He mentioned knowing judges, prosecutors, and political figures who understood the value of successful real estate development and who wouldn't appreciate efforts to damage the reputation of prominent local business leaders based on unsubstantiated allegations. The recording captured Marcus's attempts at intimidation and his implied threats against anyone who might cooperate with law enforcement investigations. His comments about having influential connections would later prove valuable for investigating potential corruption and obstruction of justice charges that could be added to the fraud and money laundering charges the FBI was already preparing. As our conversation continued, Marcus became increasingly agitated and began making statements that clearly demonstrated his guilt and awareness that his criminal activities were being investigated. He talked about the need to protect family assets from government seizure and suggested that we might need to move money to offshore accounts or transfer property ownership to avoid potential legal complications. Marcus's discussion of asset protection strategies was essentially a confession to money laundering and conspiracy to defraud the government. He was so focused on trying to recruit me as an accomplice in his efforts to hide stolen assets that he didn't realize he was providing federal investigators with evidence of additional crimes that could extend his potential prison sentence significantly. The most revealing moment came when Marcus lost his temper and started ranting about ungrateful family members and business partners who didn't appreciate the risks he'd taken to provide financial security for everyone around him. He claimed that every dollar he'd obtained through his business activities had been invested in projects that would eventually benefit the entire family, and that anyone who questioned his methods was too naive to understand sophisticated business strategy. Marcus's narcissistic rage revealed the psychological profile that Dr. Kim had prepared me to expect. He genuinely believed that his criminal activities were justified because they served his vision of family prosperity, and he couldn't understand why anyone would object to illegal methods that produced financial benefit. His complete lack of empathy for the victims he'd defrauded was shocking, even though I'd been prepared for it. When Marcus realized that I wasn't going to be recruited as an accomplice in his schemes, his approach shifted toward direct threat. He warned me that speaking to investigators about private family matters could result in criminal charges against me for making false statements, and that I could lose my job at the hospital if I became involved in a high-profile criminal case. Marcus also threatened to contest Dad's will and claim that I had manipulated Dad into changing his estate planning in ways that unfairly benefited me at Marcus's expense. He suggested that he had evidence of my supposed manipulation and that pursuing legal action against him would result in me losing any inheritance I might otherwise receive. But Marcus's threats actually provided additional evidence for the federal case against him. His willingness to make false accusations and threaten frivolous lawsuits demonstrated the pattern of intimidation and manipulation that he used against anyone who threatened his criminal activity. The recording captured his threats clearly and would help prosecutors demonstrate that Marcus posed an ongoing danger to witnesses and victims. The meeting concluded when Marcus realized that his intimidation tactics weren't working and that I wasn't going to become his accomplice in hiding evidence or obstructing the investigation. He made one final threat, warning me that I was making a serious mistake by not accepting his protection and guidance in dealing with the legal complications that would inevitably arise from the investigation. As Marcus left the hotel, he was followed by FBI surveillance teams who documented his movements and communications over the following days. The recordings from our confrontation provided federal prosecutors with crucial evidence of witness intimidation, conspiracy to obstruct justice, and additional financial crimes that Marcus had revealed while trying to recruit me as an accomplice. Agent Reeves was extremely pleased with the evidence we'd gathered, explaining that Marcus's threats and admissions had significantly strengthened the federal case against him and his associate. The recording demonstrated that Marcus was aware he was under investigation, that he was actively trying to hide evidence and intimidate witnesses, and that he posed an ongoing threat to the integrity of the judicial process. But the confrontation also marked a turning point in the investigation, because Marcus now knew that I wasn't going to cooperate with his efforts to obstruct justice. Agent Reeves warned me that Marcus might escalate his intimidation tactics or take more desperate measures to protect himself from prosecution. Enhanced security measures were implemented to protect me and my family from potential retaliation. The federal investigation entered its final phase following my confrontation with Marcus. Grand jury proceedings were accelerated and arrest warrants were prepared for Marcus and his primary associate. The evidence we'd gathered through recorded conversations, combined with Dad's documentation and the FBI's independent investigation, provided prosecutors with an overwhelming case that would be difficult for Marcus to defend against. Within a week of our hotel meeting, the entire criminal network would be arrested in coordinated raids across Washington and Oregon. Marcus's reign of financial terror was about to end, and justice would finally be served for Dad's memory and for all the families whose trust and savings Marcus had ruthlessly exploited. The confrontation at the Fairmont Olympic Hotel had provided the final pieces of evidence needed to destroy Marcus's criminal empire and ensure that he faced the full consequences of his crime. His attempts to intimidate and manipulate me had backfired spectacularly, giving federal prosecutors the additional charges they needed to ensure he would spend decades in prison for his systematic theft and fraud. The war against Marcus was approaching its climax, and his own words would be the weapons used to achieve his downfall. The coordinated arrests began at dawn on Tuesday morning with simultaneous raids across 4 states. I watched from Agent Reeves's surveillance van as federal agents surrounded Marcus's downtown condominium building, their tactical gear and armored vehicles creating a scene that looked like something from a crime drama. The moment I had been working toward for months was finally happening, and Marcus was about to face the consequences of 15 years of systematic fraud and theft. Agent Reeves had positioned me at the surveillance location so I could witness Marcus's arrest while remaining safely distant from any potential violence or escape attempt. The FBI had learned that Marcus kept weapons in his condominium and had been making inquiries about private aircraft rentals, suggesting he might attempt to flee the country if he suspected imminent arrest. The technical team monitoring radio communications reported that Marcus was awake and moving around his apartment when agents entered the building. Security cameras showed him looking out his window at the federal vehicles below, and his phone records indicated he was making rapid calls to associates and attorneys in what appeared to be a desperate attempt to warn others or arrange immediate legal representation. When federal agents knocked on Marcus's door at exactly 6:15 a.m., the audio surveillance equipment captured his shocked reaction as he realized the scope of the law enforcement response. Agent Reeves explained that Marcus had clearly been expecting some kind of investigation, but the coordinated multi-state operation involving dozens of federal agents had caught him completely unprepared for the reality of his situation. Marcus's arrest was swift and professional, but his reaction revealed the narcissistic personality that had driven his criminal behavior for so many years. Instead of remaining silent or requesting an attorney, he immediately began protesting his innocence and claiming that the federal agents were making a serious mistake that would result in lawsuits and political consequences for their career. The agents searching Marcus's condominium discovered evidence that exceeded even the FBI's expectations for the scope of his criminal activity. Multiple computers containing detailed records of fraudulent transactions, fake documents ready for use in future schemes, and communication logs showing coordination with criminal associates across multiple states. More damning was a sophisticated document forgery setup including signature stamps, official-looking letterhead, and equipment for creating fake identification documents. But the most shocking discovery in Marcus's apartment was a detailed surveillance file on me that included photographs, work schedules, and personal information about my daily routine. Marcus had been monitoring my activities since Dad's death, apparently concerned that I might discover his theft of the inheritance and planning to take preemptive action if I became a threat to his operation. The surveillance file revealed that Marcus had hired a private investigator to track my movements and had been planning to frame me for financial crimes related to Dad's estate if I continued investigating his activity. The file contained forged documents that would have made it appear that I had been stealing from Dad's accounts and that my accusations against Marcus were attempts to cover up my own crime. Agent Reeves showed me photographs of the evidence recovered from Marcus's apartment, and seeing the extent of his preparation for destroying me was both terrifying and infuriating. Marcus hadn't just stolen my inheritance, he had been actively planning to send me to prison for crimes he had committed. The depth of his betrayal went far beyond financial theft to encompass a complete willingness to destroy my life to protect his criminal enterprise. The arrests of Marcus's associates were equally dramatic and revealing. David Rodriguez was taken into custody at Seattle-Tacoma International Airport while attempting to board a flight to Mexico City with multiple fake passports and over $200,000 in cash. The attempted flight confirmed that the criminal network had been planning to flee the country as soon as they realized their operations were being investigated. Thomas Kim, the corrupt building official who had been approving fake permits for Marcus's non-existent development projects, was arrested at his office in front of colleagues and city council members who had no idea about his involvement in the fraud scheme. The public nature of his arrest sent shockwaves through Seattle's construction and development community, as Kim had been considered a respected professional with an impeccable reputation. Jennifer Walsh, the real estate agent who had been creating false property listings and facilitating fraudulent sales, was arrested at her home in front of her children who were preparing to leave for school. The domestic setting of her arrest highlighted how the criminal network had been operating within normal family and professional environments while systematically stealing from their community. But the most significant arrest occurred in Portland, where federal agents took Robert Chen into custody at his supposed construction company headquarters. Robert was not actually related to our family despite sharing our surname, but he had been using the connection to claim credibility with Asian American investors who trusted him because of our family's reputation in the community. Robert's arrest revealed that Marcus's criminal network had been exploiting cultural and ethnic connections to target specific communities with tailored fraud schemes. They had been researching potential victims' backgrounds and using shared heritage or community connections to build trust before stealing their savings. The psychological manipulation involved in these targeted approaches added another layer of cruelty to their already devastating financial crimes. The coordination between law enforcement agencies in executing the arrests was remarkable in its precision and effectiveness. Within 3 hours, 12 members of the criminal network were in federal custody, and search warrants were being executed at over 20 locations, including homes, offices, storage facilities, and safe deposit boxes associated with the organization. The search of Marcus's business office revealed the full scope of his fraudulent operation. Filing cabinets contained detailed profiles on hundreds of potential victims, including financial information, family relationships, and psychological assessments that had been used to design personalized fraud approaches. The level of preparation and research Marcus had conducted before targeting victims demonstrated that his crimes were not opportunistic but were the result of careful planning and systematic exploitation. Computer forensics teams discovered that Marcus had been using sophisticated software to track the effectiveness of different fraud approaches and to identify the most profitable victim demographic. He had been operating his criminal enterprise like a legitimate business, with performance metrics, market analysis, and strategic planning that would have been impressive if applied to legal activity. The financial analysis of Marcus's operations revealed that he had stolen over $14 million from more than 300 victims across the Pacific Northwest. The money had been moved through dozens of shell companies and offshore accounts in a money laundering operation that rivaled those used by major international criminal organizations. But recovering the stolen funds would prove to be extremely challenging because Marcus and his associates had been very sophisticated in hiding their assets. Much of the money had been transferred to accounts in countries with strict banking secrecy laws, and some had been converted into physical assets like artwork, jewelry, and precious metals that could be easily transported and difficult to trace. The federal prosecutors handling the case explained that asset recovery in complex fraud cases often takes years and that victims might recover only a fraction of their losses even if the criminal prosecution is completely successful. This reality was particularly devastating for the elderly victims who had lost their retirement savings and who didn't have time to rebuild their financial security. Margaret and Robert Peterson, the elderly couple who had invested $60,000 with Marcus, were among the first victims I contacted after the arrests to explain what had happened and what they could expect from the legal proceedings. Their reaction was a mixture of relief that justice was being served and despair about their financial future. Margaret cried when I told her that Marcus had been arrested and that the federal government was taking his crimes seriously. She said that she had been afraid that someone as smooth and well-connected as Marcus would never face consequences for stealing from ordinary people like her and Robert. But she also expressed worry about whether they would ever recover enough money to avoid losing their home. The victim impact of Marcus's crimes extended far beyond the financial losses, devastating as those were. Many victims reported feeling betrayed and humiliated that they had been deceived by someone they trusted. Several elderly victims developed health problems related to the stress of losing their savings, and some families were forced to move in with relatives or dramatically reduce their standard of living. The psychological impact on the families was particularly severe for those who had known Marcus since childhood or who had been friends with our parents for decades. They felt that their trust in our family name and reputation had been exploited, and some expressed anger toward me for not preventing Marcus's crimes even though I had been deceived as thoroughly as they had been. Patricia Kim helped me understand that victim anger was a normal part of the recovery process and that many people needed to direct their fury somewhere while they processed the trauma of being defrauded. She warned me that some victims might blame me for Marcus's actions or expect me to personally compensate them for their losses, even though I had also been victimized by his crimes. The media attention surrounding the arrests was intense and sometimes overwhelming. The story of a successful real estate developer who had stolen millions from family and friends while forging documents to cheat his own sister out of her inheritance captured public attention in ways that typical white-collar crime cases often don't. Local news stations positioned the story as a cautionary tale about trusting family members with financial matters, and several national news programs featured segments about investment fraud, targeting elderly victims. The coverage was generally accurate and sympathetic to the victims, but the constant attention made it difficult for affected families to process their trauma privately. Marcus's arraignment took place 3 days after his arrest in a packed federal courtroom that included many of his victims as well as media representatives and curious members of the public. Seeing him in an orange jumpsuit and shackles was surreal after decades of viewing him as my successful, protective older brother. The federal prosecutor, Assistant U.S. Attorney Linda Martinez, outlined the charges against Marcus in language that made clear the government considered him a serious career criminal rather than someone who had made a few poor business decisions. The charges included wire fraud, money laundering, conspiracy, identity theft, witness intimidation, and obstruction of justice. Marcus's attorney attempted to portray him as a legitimate businessman who had made some questionable decisions under financial pressure but who had never intended to harm anyone. The defense argued that the real estate market collapse had prevented Marcus's development projects from succeeding, and that he had always intended to repay investors once market conditions improved. But Judge Patricia Williams was clearly unimpressed with the defense arguments, particularly given the evidence of forged documents, offshore money transfers, and systematic targeting of elderly victims. She denied Marcus's request for bail, explaining that his access to hidden assets and his demonstrated willingness to flee the country made him a serious flight risk. Marcus's reaction to being denied bail was revealing of his continued narcissism and refusal to accept responsibility for his actions. He turned toward the gallery where victims and family members were seated and made eye contact with several people, including me, with an expression that seemed to blame us for his predicament rather than acknowledging his own criminal behavior. The federal prosecution team began preparing for trial while simultaneously working to trace and recover assets that Marcus and his associates had hidden. The complexity of the money laundering operation meant that forensic accountants and international banking experts would be needed to follow the paper trail of stolen funds. Agent Reeves explained that federal prosecutors were confident they could convict Marcus and his associates based on the evidence we had gathered, but that recovering money for victims would require cooperation from financial institutions and governments in multiple countries. Some of the stolen funds might never be recovered, particularly money that had been converted to untraceable assets or spent on personal expenses. The plea negotiations with Marcus's associates revealed additional details about the scope and duration of the criminal enterprise. Several defendants agreed to cooperate with prosecutors in exchange for reduced sentences, providing testimony about Marcus's role as the leader of the organization and his personal involvement in targeting specific victims. David Rodriguez's cooperation was particularly valuable because he had been responsible for maintaining the technical infrastructure that allowed the network to create fake documents and move money through shell companies. His testimony would help prosecutors prove that Marcus had been the mastermind behind the sophisticated criminal operation, rather than a participant who had been manipulated by others. Thomas Kim's testimony revealed the extent of corruption within Seattle's building permit process and led to additional investigations of other officials who might have been accepting bribes to approve fraudulent development projects. His cooperation exposed systemic weaknesses in municipal oversight that had allowed Marcus's network to operate without detection for so many years. But Marcus himself refused all plea negotiations and insisted on proceeding to trial, apparently convinced that his attorney could convince a jury that he was the victim of a vindictive investigation, rather than a career criminal who had systematically defrauded hundreds of families. The trial preparation process required me to spend countless hours with federal prosecutors reviewing evidence and preparing testimony about Marcus's crimes and their impact on our family. The experience was emotionally exhausting because it required me to relive the betrayal and deception while maintaining the professional composure necessary for effective courtroom testimony. Rebecca Martinez, my probate attorney, worked with the federal prosecutors to ensure that Marcus's conviction would facilitate recovery of my inheritance and resolution of Dad's estate issues. The forged documents Marcus had filed with the probate court would need to be formally invalidated, and the house sale would need to be reversed if possible. But the house Marcus had claimed to sell had never actually been sold to a legitimate buyer. Instead, he had transferred ownership to one of his shell companies in a fraudulent transaction designed to hide the asset from creditors and investigators. The fake sale had allowed him to claim that my inheritance had been distributed while actually maintaining control of the property for his own benefit. The discovery that the house sale had been completely fraudulent was both infuriating and encouraging. It meant that Marcus's theft of my inheritance was even more brazen than I had initially understood, but it also meant that recovering the property might be possible once his criminal convictions were finalized. James and I began making plans to reclaim Dad's house once the legal proceedings were completed. The property had been maintained by a management company that Marcus had hired using stolen funds, so it was in good condition despite being unoccupied for most of the year since Dad's death. The prospect of moving back into the family home where I had grown up was emotionally complex. The house held wonderful memories of childhood and family gatherings, but it was also now connected to Marcus's betrayal and Dad's death under circumstances that might have been related to the stress of discovering his son's criminal behavior. But reclaiming the house would also be a way of honoring Dad's memory and ensuring that his wishes for our inheritance were finally respected. The home represented everything our parents had worked to achieve in America, and allowing Marcus's crimes to result in its permanent loss would have been another victory for his criminal enterprise. The federal trial was scheduled to begin in 6 months, giving prosecutors time to prepare their case and defense attorneys time to review the massive amount of evidence that had been collected. Agent Reeves warned me that the trial would likely be emotionally difficult because Marcus's attorneys would probably try to attack my credibility and suggest that my accusations were motivated by greed or family jealousy. But I was prepared to face whatever attacks Marcus's defense team might launch because I knew that Dad's evidence and the FBI's investigation had revealed the truth about Marcus's systematic criminal behavior. The recordings of our conversations provided clear proof of his crimes, and the cooperation of his former associates would make it impossible for him to deny his leadership role in the fraud network. The investigation that had begun with my discovery of forged signatures on probate documents had exposed one of the largest investment fraud schemes in Pacific Northwest history. Marcus's arrest and the dismantling of his criminal network would protect other families from becoming victims while ensuring that justice was finally served for Dad's memory and for all the innocent people whose trust and savings Marcus had ruthlessly exploited. The federal trial lasted 6 weeks and became the most closely watched white-collar crime prosecution in Seattle's history. Marcus's defense team, led by prominent criminal attorney Michael Sterling, attempted every possible strategy to minimize his responsibility and shift blame to market conditions, regulatory failures, and even the victims themselves for making poor investment decisions. Sterling's opening statement portrayed Marcus as an ambitious entrepreneur who had tried to help families achieve financial security through real estate investments that unfortunately failed due to circumstances beyond his control. According to the defense narrative, Marcus was actually the biggest victim because he had invested his own money and reputation in projects that external economic forces had doomed to failure. But Assistant U.S. Attorney Linda Martinez methodically dismantled every defense argument with evidence that demonstrated Marcus's deliberate criminal intent and sophisticated plan. The prosecution's case began with testimony from forensic accountants who traced the flow of stolen money through Marcus's network of shell companies and offshore accounts. The financial evidence revealed that Marcus had never invested significant amounts of his own money in the development projects he promoted to victims. Instead, he had been using new investor money to pay fabricated returns to earlier investors, while skimming enormous amounts for personal expenses and luxury purchases. Richard Thompson, a forensic psychologist who specialized in financial fraud, explained how Marcus had used sophisticated psychological manipulation techniques to exploit his victims' trust and overcome their natural skepticism about investment opportunities. Dr. Thompson's analysis of Marcus's recorded conversations with victims showed deliberate use of persuasion tactics typically employed by professional con artists. The prosecution presented evidence of Marcus's lavish lifestyle funded by stolen money, including receipts for luxury cars, expensive jewelry, and exclusive vacations that totaled over $800,000 during the period when he was claiming business losses to investors. Photographs of Marcus at expensive restaurants and private clubs directly contradicted his claims of financial hardship. But the most damaging evidence came from the recorded conversations I had conducted with Marcus during the FBI investigation. The jury heard Marcus's own voice confessing to document forgery, describing his access to Dad's financial accounts and threatening to retaliate against family members who cooperated with law enforcement. When I testified about Marcus's systematic theft of Dad's assets and his elaborate scheme to forge estate documents, several jurors appeared visibly angry at the betrayal of family trust. My testimony was particularly powerful because it demonstrated that Marcus was willing to victimize even his closest relatives to advance his criminal enterprise. Marcus's former associates who had agreed to cooperate with prosecutors provided devastating testimony about his role as the leader of the criminal network. David Rodriguez testified that Marcus had recruited him by promising that their fraud schemes were so sophisticated that they would never be caught by law enforcement or regulatory agents. Thomas Kim's testimony revealed that Marcus had paid him over $150,000 in bribes to approve building permits for projects that existed only on paper. Kim explained that Marcus had specifically targeted corrupt officials who could provide legitimacy for his fraudulent development claims. The cooperation agreements required these witnesses to provide complete and truthful testimony about all aspects of the criminal conspiracy, and their detailed accounts of Marcus's planning and leadership made it impossible for the defense to characterize him as a minor participant or unwitting accomplice. Marcus's decision to testify in his own defense proved to be a catastrophic mistake that sealed his conviction. Under cross-examination by prosecutor Martinez, Marcus's narcissism and sense of entitlement became obvious to the jury as he struggled to explain away the overwhelming evidence of his crimes. Marcus attempted to justify his theft from Dad's accounts by claiming that Dad had given him broad authority to manage family finances, and that everything he had done was intended to benefit both Dad and me. But when Martinez presented Dad's own investigation files documenting Marcus's unauthorized transactions, Marcus became defensive and started contradicting his earlier testimony. The most damaging moment came when Martinez played recordings of Marcus threatening to frame me for financial crimes if I continued cooperating with investigators. The jury heard Marcus's voice clearly stating his intention to destroy his own sister's life to protect his criminal enterprise, revealing a level of callousness that shocked even experienced court observers. Marcus's testimony about his investment business became increasingly unbelievable as Martinez forced him to explain specific details about projects that had never existed. When confronted with evidence that the Costa Rica development he had promoted to investors was completely fictional, Marcus claimed that zoning changes had prevented construction while maintaining that investor money had been properly spent on preliminary development costs. The defense's closing argument attempted to portray Marcus as someone who had made questionable business decisions, but who had never intended to harm anyone. Sterling argued that the complexity of real estate development made it difficult to distinguish between legitimate business strategies and criminal fraud, and that prosecuting ambitious entrepreneurs for business failures would discourage economic growth and innovation. But Martinez's closing argument focused on the deliberate nature of Marcus's crimes and the devastating impact on his victims. She reminded the jury that Marcus had forged legal documents, stolen from his own father, and threatened family members who discovered his crime. She argued that Marcus's sophisticated planning and systematic targeting of vulnerable victims demonstrated criminal intent that went far beyond poor business judgment. The jury deliberated for only 8 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all 23 criminal counts. The speed of their decisions suggested that Marcus's own testimony had convinced them of his guilt more effectively than any prosecution evidence could have accomplished. Marcus's reaction to the guilty verdicts revealed his continued refusal to accept responsibility for his actions. Instead of showing remorse or acknowledgement of his crimes, he turned toward the gallery and glared at me and other family members who had testified against him, apparently still believing that we were responsible for his downfall rather than his own criminal behavior. The sentencing hearing 3 months later provided an opportunity for victims to address the court about the impact Marcus's crimes had caused to their lives and family. Over 30 victims testified about losing their life savings, being forced to sell their homes, and suffering health problems related to the stress of financial devastation. Margaret Peterson's testimony was particularly moving as she described how losing $60,000 to Marcus's fraud had forced her and Robert to move out of their family home and live with relatives at ages when they should have been enjoying retirement security. She said that the betrayal of trust hurt almost as much as the financial loss because Marcus had exploited her friendship with our parents to steal money she and Robert had saved for 40 years. The victim impact statements revealed that Marcus's crimes had caused suffering that extended far beyond financial losses. Several elderly victims had developed depression and anxiety disorders after discovering they had been defrauded. Some families had been torn apart by arguments about how they could have been so easily deceived by someone they had trusted completely. When given the opportunity to address the court before sentencing, Marcus delivered a rambling statement that blamed everyone except himself for the situation. He claimed that his victims had been willing participants in risky investments, and that the government's prosecution was motivated by political considerations rather than legitimate law enforcement concerns. Marcus's complete lack of remorse and his continued attempts to blame his victims convinced Judge Patricia Williams that he posed an ongoing danger to the community and was unlikely to rehabilitate himself even after serving a lengthy prison sentence. Judge Williams sentenced Marcus to 45 years in federal prison without possibility of parole, explaining that the sophistication of his crimes, the number of victims, and his continued refusal to accept responsibility required a sentence that would protect the public from future fraud schemes. The sentence effectively meant that Marcus would spend the rest of his life in prison. The sentences for Marcus's associates ranged from 8 to 20 years, with the longest terms reserved for those who had played leadership roles in the conspiracy. Thomas Kim received 15 years for his role in providing corrupt permits, while David Rodriguez received 12 years for managing the money laundering operation. The asset forfeiture proceedings that followed the criminal convictions resulted in the seizure of all property and financial accounts connected to Marcus's criminal enterprise. The federal government recovered approximately $6 million in cash and assets that could be distributed to victims through a court-supervised restitution process. But recovering the full amount stolen by Marcus proved impossible because much of the money had been spent on personal expenses or transferred to accounts in countries that refused to cooperate with U.S. asset forfeiture efforts. Most victims received only 30 to 40% of their losses through the restitution process. The resolution of Dad's estate required separate legal proceedings to invalidate all the fraudulent documents Marcus had filed with the probate court. Rebecca Martinez successfully demonstrated that Marcus had forged my signature on multiple estate documents and had fraudulently transferred ownership of the family home to one of his shell companies. The probate court ordered that Dad's estate be reopened and administered according to his actual will rather than the forged documents Marcus had created. This process resulted in the family home being returned to my ownership and the proper distribution of Dad's other assets, according to his genuine wishes. Taking possession of Dad's house 18 months after his death was emotionally overwhelming. James and I spent weeks going through rooms that Marcus had ransacked while searching for valuable items to steal. We found gaps in Dad's library where first edition books had been removed, empty spaces in Mom's jewelry boxes, and missing family photographs that had apparently been taken as potential evidence of asset ownership. But we also discovered items that Marcus had overlooked, including letters Dad had written to family members in Taiwan, recipes in Mom's handwriting for traditional dishes she had cooked during my childhood, and photo albums documenting our family's early years in America that provided precious memories Marcus's crimes couldn't destroy. The decision to move back into the family home rather than selling it was driven by our desire to honor Dad's memory and to reclaim the inheritance that Marcus had tried to steal. The house represented everything our parents had achieved through decades of hard work and sacrifice, and allowing Marcus's crimes to result in its loss would have given him a final victory even from his prison cell. Renovating the house became a therapeutic process that helped James and me heal from the trauma of Marcus's betrayal while creating new memories in spaces that had been tainted by his criminal activity. We converted Dad's office into a nursery when we learned that we were expecting our first child, a daughter we planned to name Linda in honor of my mother. The Pacific Northwest Real Estate Fraud Victims Coalition that emerged from our case became a powerful advocacy organization that successfully lobbied for stronger regulation of real estate investment schemes and better protection for elderly investors. The coalition's efforts resulted in new state laws requiring enhanced disclosure for development projects and mandatory background checks for real estate promoters. My testimony before the Washington state legislature about Marcus's crimes and their impact on victims helped convince lawmakers to pass the Chen Family Protection, which strengthened penalties for investment fraud targeting seniors and required financial institutions to implement better safeguards against elder financial abuse. But the most meaningful outcome of our long struggle for justice was the relationships we built with other victims who became extended family members united by our shared experience of betrayal and recovery. Margaret and Robert Peterson became surrogate grandparents to our daughter, and several other victim families joined us for holiday celebrations at the family home. Emma Patterson, the young woman whose DNA research had first revealed Marcus's pattern of targeting families, graduated from law school and joined the U.S. Attorney's Office as a prosecutor specializing in financial crime. Her personal experience as a victim of family fraud made her a particularly effective advocate for other families facing similar betrayal. The financial recovery process took over 3 years to complete, but the restitution payments from Marcus's seized assets, combined with insurance settlements and civil lawsuit recoveries, eventually restored most of our family's financial security. More importantly, the criminal convictions provided the closure and validation that money alone could never have achieved. Marcus never acknowledged his crimes or expressed remorse for the damage he caused to dozens of families who had trusted him. Prison psychologists who evaluated him for parole eligibility reported that he continued to blame his victims and family members for his conviction, demonstrating the same narcissistic personality traits that had enabled his criminal behavior for so many years. The investigation that began with my discovery of forged documents in Dad's probate file had exposed one of the largest family fraud schemes in federal court history. Marcus's conviction sent a clear message that sophisticated financial criminals would face serious consequences regardless of their social status or family connections. But the most important victory was personal rather than legal. By pursuing justice for Marcus's crimes, I had honored Dad's memory and completed the investigation he had started before his death. The evidence Dad had collected in his safe deposit box had provided the foundation for bringing Marcus to justice and protecting other families from becoming victims of his ongoing fraud scheme. Standing in Dad's garden 3 years after his death, watching my daughter Linda take her first steps where her grandfather had once tended his flowers, I felt a sense of peace that Marcus's crimes had briefly seemed to destroy forever. The family home that he had tried to steal would now provide security and memories for a new generation who would grow up knowing the truth about family loyalty and the importance of fighting for justice. The betrayal that began with a simple text message about selling Dad's house had revealed depths of criminal behavior that none of us could have imagined. But it had also demonstrated that truth and persistence could overcome even the most sophisticated deception, and that families united by love and honesty were stronger than any criminal conspiracy designed to tear them apart. Marcus had spent his life building an empire of lies that ultimately collapsed under the weight of his own arrogance and greed. Meanwhile, our family had been rebuilt on a foundation of truth that would protect future generations from similar betrayal. In the end, justice had not just been served, it had created something stronger and more valuable than anything Marcus had tried to steal. Up next, You've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.